My title is John Paul II and the Crises of Modern Times. Do a Boolean search on Google for modern times, modify it with the word crisis, then remove all references to Charlie Chaplin's famous 1936 movie Modern Times, and you'll still have more than 4 million hits. One discovers right away that the very idiom modern times evokes endless, but very familiar tropes of crisis. Wars, agricultural policies, schools, cities, climates, diseases, on and on. Not even the Western European Dark Ages, under the imaginative inspiration of Monty Python, can compete with what we moderns are apt to believe about our own modernity. So, tonight, I'll begin by using some very broad strokes, appropriate for a dinner talk. I'd like to compare two modern times. First, the closing decades of the 19th century, and then the closing decades of the 20th. Here stood two great pontificates, that of Leo XIII and of John Paul II. Leo was the first pope to be born in the 19th century and the first to die in the 20th. Elected exactly 1 century after Leo's election in 1878, John Paul was the first pope to be born in the 20th century and the first pope to die in the 21st. The two pontificates together amounted to some 52 years. But even more telling is the fact that measured from Leo's birth in 1810 to John Paul II's death in 2005, the lived experience of these two men encompass modern times, both secular and ecclesiastical, from Napoleon to the iPhone, from the Papal States and the Austrian Empire. John Paul II's father served in what remained of the Holy Roman Empire, to European Union, from Our Lady of Lourdes to the other Madonna. It's all encompassed in these two lives. Given the contingencies of history, some of the parallels between Leo and John Paul are quite uncanny. The first is of paramount importance. They were conciliar popes. Each was elected in the wake of a controversial ecumenical council. In Leo's case, that was Vatican Council I, 1869 to 1870. It ended abruptly by the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in the summer of 1870. That was the official excuse. The reality, however, was that the temporal governments in Europe threatened to intervene militarily to stop the council before it even began. Under political pressure from their home governments, the bishops solemnly affirmed papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction of the Holy See and got out of town as quick as they could. After another very troubled century that included two world wars, the Second Vatican Council commenced in the fall of 1962. I call them conciliar popes for two reasons. Each in their respective council had the right experience for playing a significant role. As Archbishop of Perugia, Archbishop Pecci, he was not a cardinal yet, held his diocese together for some 30 years, despite constant harassment by the laicist Italian government, which confiscated ecclesiastical properties, sporadically imposed a kind of martial law on church liberties. Even so, from 1847 until 1878, Archbishop Pecci found the time to teach philosophy and theology. He was a philosopher bishop. For his part, Cardinal Archbishop Wojtyła brought to the Second Vatican Council not only episcopal experience honed under political circumstances under the communists, even more burdensome than Pecci's, but also brought his training and experience as a teacher and an author of philosophy and theology. Another philosopher pope. I also call them conciliar because these popes, each in turn, devoted their pontificates to interpreting, consolidating, and applying the teachings of their respective councils. For Leo's part, he had to reconcile the conciliar document Dei Filius, which rather tersely but clearly affirmed the harmony of faith and reason, with Quanta Cura and its Syllabus of Errors from 1864. These were not so easily reconciled documents. The syllabus consisted of some 80 erroneous propositions that had to be negated. And of course, I suppose all of you know the notorious 80th proposition. Quote, the Roman pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. In the first year of his pontificate, Leo therefore issued the encyclical Aeterni Patris, laying out how to reconcile Dei Filius with the syllabus of errors. The church, he said, is not a clerical penitentiary. It's rather a domus sapientiae, having a twofold pedagogy of philosophy and theology, and that the master of this twofold pedagogy is St. Thomas, who pushed his philosophical inquiry into the reasons and principles of things, but most importantly, developed analogies between things naturally known and the theological mysteries. Just as urgently, Leo had to harmonize the conciliar document Pastor Aeternus, which solemnly declared the universal jurisdiction of the Holy See, with the life of social and political institutions on the ground that were no longer part juridically of a Christendom. Vatican I, indeed, had declared the death of de facto national churches. Vatican I accomplished what the French in the Third Republic called it, a one-way separation of the church from the temporal powers. And political Christendom, as it had existed in the West for some 1,600 years, was over, to the astonishment of European cabinets and public opinion. It was done by the hand of the church, not the state. But no one had a playbook for an autonomous church. It existed on paper, but how to make it exist in a kind of interface on the ground with modern institutions, which were openly hostile to the church. There was no playbook for it. Leo had to figure it out. He went on the offense of writing some 110 encyclicals, in which he attempted to distinguish and harmonize diverse social forms, modes of authority, and institutions. He especially recommended the teachings of Thomas for the true meaning of liberty and for the divine origin of all authority. Let me roll the reel ahead. Whereas Vatican I produced only 2 documents, the Second Vatican Council produced 16. The intellectual, doctrinal, and even the pastoral threads connecting these documents were pretty loosely woven. As we know, bishops and theologians disagreed about the spirit and the letter of the documents. The Declaration on Religious Liberty, for example, was widely considered discontinuous with church teaching, and that was deemed good by some and treasonous by others. The encyclical Humanae Vitae, 3 years later, on contraception, was regarded as too consistent with church tradition, which once again was deemed good by some and retrograde by others. Important and influential theologians made the Constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, a mere footnote to the document on the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, as though the Catholic Church was simply a leaf blowing in the wind of the 1960s. So after his election, John Paul set out quickly to reconcile Gaudium et Spes, section 12. All things on earth should be related to man as their center and crown, with Gaudium et Spes 22. Christ, the final Adam, by the revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to himself, and with Gaudium et Spes, section 36. When God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible. John Paul worried that under the influence of various strands of modern humanism, Gaudium et Spes 12, all things on earth should be related to man as their center and crown, would be misinterpreted and put in opposition to the other parts of Gaudium et Spes, obscuring or even breaking the full mysterium hominis, which is not just man, but old Adam and new Adam. Hence his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, the first of a trilogy of encyclicals on the Divine Trinity. And throughout this trilogy, John Paul II made the same move. The question, what does it mean to rule, is turned back to the question, what is man? And the anthropological question is developed in light of things revealed by the Son, then about the Father, and finally through the Spirit. More about that later. A second commonality of these two men, besides being conciliar popes, Leo was the founder of the Roman Academy of St. Thomas, and JP2 was its refounder, now called the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. And they did so under similar circumstances. 1 year after issuing the encyclical Aeterni Patris, his encyclical on faith and reason, Leo's great encyclical, he brought the Perusian Academy of St. Thomas to Rome. It was kind of like a think tank, but it became virtually a writing factory. At his election in 1878, no one expected that a 68-year-old pope would write 110 teaching letters. It's also correct to speak of a Leonine era because 6 popes came of age or were born during his pontificate. I have not found another example in church history of this. Pius X, born 1835, is a young priest. Benedict XV, 1854. Pius XI, 1857. Pius XII, 1876. John the 23rd, 1881. In fact, he was young enough to write a fan letter to Leo XIII about Rerum Novarum. And Paul VI, 1897. I mean, any notion that there could have been a hermeneutic of complete discontinuity doesn't understand historical facts here. It was so many popes born in a similar era and intertwined through Leonine teaching allowed for a remarkably rapid and coherent transmission of doctrine, really in the manner of a school, although Pius XI would call it a tradition. By the way, Pius XI and Paul VI, as young priests, received their doctorates in Thomistic philosophy at the Roman Academy. In the 21st year of his pontificate, John Paul II pointed out, Leo XIII, with his encyclical Aeterni Patris, took a step of historic importance for the life of the Church, since it remains to this day the one papal document of authority devoted entirely to philosophy. And thus, John Paul II issued Fides et Ratio, revisiting the relationship between faith and philosophy. It's necessary, he wrote, that the mind of the believer acquire a natural, consistent, and true knowledge of created realities of the world and of man himself. Still more, reason must be able to articulate this knowledge in concept and argument. 1 year later, exactly in the pattern of Leo, he issued the apostolic letter Inter Munera, where he promulgated the revised statutes of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas. Finally, a third commonality. Both popes had an acute appreciation of the secunda pars of the Summa. We recall the prologue of the secunda pars. Since, as Damascene states, man is said to be made in God's image, insofar as the image implies an intelligent being endowed with free will and self-movement. Now that we have treated of the exemplar and of the things which came forth from the power of God in accordance with his will, it remains for us to treat of his image, inasmuch as man, too, has a principle of his actions as having free will and control of his actions. So the secunda pars considers actions of the human image bearer according to both creation and redemption, according to both precept and habit. To use Wojtyłan terms, we are here in the sphere of the acting person, the image bearer who achieves perfection through his acts. Here too, we also find the doctrine of participation, which proved so important for the social magisterium of both Leo and John Paul. The doctrine enters right into Thomas's famous definition of natural law. Now, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence, being provident both for himself and for others. So human action, with all due metaphysical qualifications, represents what God and man do together in different orders of causality to produce a single effect. Having a created share in God's providence, the human person can go on to be provident for himself and others. John Paul would eventually call this participated theonomy, What exists simply in God is communicated to creatures in a multiform manner. There's a double imitation or portrayal. First, a diversity of created things, each having a good according to its own participated being. Second, a diversity of created things imitating God insofar as they cause goodness in others. That is, insofar as through their acts, they bring into existence, through secondary causality, additional modes of participation among themselves and others. Charity perfects a social principle embedded in the creation of angels and men. Namely, one loves the good not only as it is possessed and participated, but even more as it's poured forth and communicated to many. So, having noted these commonalities, I now want to take note of a difference in the situation and magisterial habits of these two popes. And again, I'm going to use broad strokes, but I think they're intriguing. When Leo became pope, he turned his attention immediately to the problems posed by modern states. These state-making regimes which emerged after the Napoleonic Wars, which were still robustly evolving in the late 19th century, viewed the social institutions of the church with suspicion. Sacramental marriage, family, schools, associations, dioceses, religious orders were deemed rivals to a new anthropological and political creed. And let's blame it on the French, man and citizen. Swept out of France through all of Europe into her former colonies. And this creed viewed the human being in two ways. First, as a being of nature, having natural liberties and rights, which had been obscured or broken by the historical social order. And second, as citizen, standing equally among other citizens before the state. And on this model, fraternity was associated preeminently, if not exclusively, with citizenship. Other social memberships, claiming origins in nature, history, or divine revelation, were deemed legitimate only insofar as they were either a matter of private choice or insofar as they were permitted or conceded by the state. And so Leo set out right away to defend social and institutional domains not reducible to citizenship. He never used the term social doctrine. That would be used by Pius XI. But what it would have meant for Leo is a doctrine about institutions. Diverse forms and modes of authority, the so-called mixed things which overlap different institutions and authorities, as well as social movements which motivate changes in institutions. In short, through the thickness of history, Leo began the long process of sorting out the social and political debris of the demise of Catholic political Christendom, fashioning a coherent teaching on social institutions. And the institutional reality was truly a mess. A few interesting facts. When Leo was born, one pope had been kidnapped and soon died in French captivity. Another was held in French captivity on the very day of his birth in 1810. Leo, in his life, had seen 3 archbishops of Paris murdered. A year before his death, he saw the French government shut down more than 2,000 Catholic schools. At the time of the French Revolution, there were more than 2,500 Benedictine abbeys in Europe. By the time Leo became Archbishop of Perugia, only 30 remained. In 1789, there were 25,000 Dominicans. When Leo was elected Pope in 1878, 3,300 remained. Half of the Prussian hierarchy languished in prisons during Bismarck's Kulturkampf. That's just the beginning of the story. It was so institutional disaster. From who possessed cemeteries to who had seminaries. And Leo's frame of reference was rather traditional. For Leo, there are 3 great institutions which by nature or grace are necessary for human eudaimonia. Marriage, family, you have to put a hyphen because they're not exactly the same institution. Polity and church. That is, the human being is a matrimonial, political, and ecclesial animal. And these three theaters or seats of eudaimonia are interrelated. In the case of sacramental marriage, overlapping. And therefore, the institutional and moral decline of one inevitably affects the fortunes of the other two. So, Leo's magisterial effort was to propose suitable institutions for man as an image bearer, and what's more, to propose how these institutions stand one to the other in a tranquility of order. This was the great Leonine response to his modern times. And institutional repair turned out to be a long and very zigzagging process. Beginning in the wake of the Revolution, it would continue through the Great Depression and the two world wars, and to the effort to rebuild Europe after 1945. Here's a truly telling point about the primacy of institutional problems for those Leonine years, or Leonine modern times. The inaugural encyclical of every pope, from Pius VI to Paul VI, dealt with one or another aspect of the church-state problem. Every single one. Had John Paul II started his pontificate in this mold, his first encyclical would have been addressed to the political situation in Eastern Europe. He would have written an encyclical about Poland. Leo wouldn't have hesitated to do it. Surely a pope from the most politically fraught sector of Europe would have something to say right away about the ruling powers along the Vistula. Right? By the way, it's really one other commonality I just have to insert. Leo took as a coat of arms a comet going across the heavens, and the motto was Lumen in Caelo. That's Leo's answer to the Enlightenment. You want to see enlightenment? Here it comes. And in fact, the Italian press said he looked rather similar to Voltaire. What's up here? Okay. And he did kind of look similar to Voltaire. John Paul II's coat of arms, as you all know, has the off-centered cross with the symbol of Mary at the foot of the cross, basically saying, late 20th century, you don't know what a human being is, ecce homo. Two different things. Leo did not set out to address the institutional problem right away. Instead, he issued Redemptor Hominis, not on the problem of the state, Hobbes's Deus Mortalis, but rather on Jesus Christ as Salvator Hominis, where his predecessors in the Leonine mold kept on asking, quid est Caesar? Redemptor Hominis begins with the question posed by Psalm 8, what is man, that you should be mindful of him? To the question, what is man, he answers, participated royalty. In his first trip to Poland after being elected pope, a trip that would really change the history of Central Europe, he called the Poles piasts, sovereigns, or those who were crowned. So too, in his trip to Cameroon, he referred to the African youth as being crowned, according to Psalm 8. As John Paul appropriated the Leonine tradition, the principles of human action out of Secunda Pars are still quite evident, but he shifted the focus from institutions to anthropology. In effect, John Paul took the social questions back to the prologue of the Secunda Pars, which is to say, back to the premise. The image bearer, as capable of efficacious rule in being provident for himself and for others. It's going to be 13 more years until he crafts an encyclical on political authority. And this is, of course, what Centesimus Annus, issued on the centennial anniversary of Rerum Novarum. In the meantime, he's exploring the anthropological virtue of regalitas. Here, I can only make a gesture in the direction of a theme of the image bearer that's summoned to the dignity and virtue of sharing in divine government, both for himself and others. In Redemptor Hominis, he proposes to discern the signs of the times. The most important signs, he contends, are not the external works of modern man, the organization of the state, science and technology, but rather man in flight from himself in fear of the very works of his own dominion. This gives rise to the question I'm quoting now. What is it that the power given to man from the beginning by which he was to subdue the earth turns against himself. And he sets out to answer the question. First in Genesis, then in the light of Christ, the new Adam, who is the image of the invisible God, who reveals the Father to man and man to himself. In Dives in Misericordia, John Paul discusses God's rule made visible in the creature. Once again, he studies the question by going back to Genesis to see how human dominion makes visible the rule of the Father, and then to the Gospels to expound the relationship between justice and mercy in divine rule. Justice without mercy, he concludes, cannot restore man to himself. Man imitates divine rule not only by making judgments concerning justice, but also by being rich in mercy. The anointed of God always announces the reign of both justice and mercy. In Dominus et Vivificatum, John Paul comments on a passage in Gaudium et Spes, when God is forgotten, the creature itself becomes unintelligible. The human rule is obscured without the Creator because it's the vocation of an image bearer to rule with God, both by created nature and the habilitation of grace. In Laborum Exercens, he discusses the acts proper to an image bearer, dominion over material creation, moral rule as a subject who acts and decides, and the provident ordering of society by a subject who acts, decides, and can rule himself and thus be provident for others. All of these themes of image-bearing, participation, and kingly predicates of self-rule were, of course, explored in his lengthy series of Wednesday audiences that come down to us as Theology of the Body. And they would be reworked yet again when John Paul moved in to the much longer and more complex encyclicals on political order, moral theology, and constitutional issues surrounding the issue of human life. And here's the part I attribute to Rocco. Prometheus in the soil of Genesis. To conclude, I want to reflect on why John Paul investigated the anthropological problem as eroding otherwise reasonable fixes to the institutional problems of the previous generation. From his earliest dramatic works, written in Krakow under German occupation, to his Lenten conferences given for Pope Paul VI shortly before his own election to the papacy, Wojtyła increasingly came to believe that the crises of modern times is anthropological. And the distinctive mark of the age is what Rocco Buttiglione has aptly called negative anthropology. The crisis is manifest in a ready affirmation of what man is not, combined with a deep-seated reluctance to affirm normative anthropological content. It should not be understood merely as an esoteric philosophy or ideology, so much as an experiential and practical option familiar to all human persons of the late 20th century. At the Second Vatican Council, Archbishop Wojtyła worked on anthropological sections for the Constitution Gaudium et Spes. And in a debate over how the document should address atheism, he insisted that atheism is not merely an academic, ideological, or political system, but a problem of the human person. The human person who is an atheist, he continued, is one persuaded of his own, if I may so speak, of his own eschatological aloneness. His intervention moved the drafters to distinguish between the external or systematic aspects of atheism, which Leo would have put largely under the institutional crises of authority, with its anthropological premises. Wojtyła was convinced that the exaltation of Adam through a negation of his natural and religious aspects has a mythic structure that overlaps with and subverts what sacred scripture reports about the frontier of Adam, who is not resolvable into either God or beast. Adam knows what he is not, and according to Wojtyła's reading of modern culture, this negative moment becomes the principal item of interest. It's the very experience to be universalized, not our common nature, but what man is not. And one or another version of this premise that human nature is radically indeterminate, Enlightenment theorists, to their credit, tended to conclude all the more reason for the civilizing task of the state, That is, if man is radically indeterminate, we need at least one determinate man, and that's the Deus Mortalis, that's the state. On what ground, if man is indeterminate, can anyone have a title to rule as a man? On what ground can a man issue a binding word to anyone else? Who has a natural right to command another member of the species? The answer, of course, no one. And therefore, men must give their consent. Men command a commanding voice, and this is the state. In other words, the older response to anthropological indeterminacy was institutional. And this is nothing other than the artificial man who is determinate in every respect. That is the state. And if this is a liberal regime, order is made determinate, but not so determinate that natural individuals lose their freedom to make themselves to be whatever they choose. It's the best of both worlds. One completely determinate human person, it's called the state, and all of the rest have the efficacious liberty of being indeterminate, at least in a liberal regime. Or as Pierre Manant has said, it allows a zone of liberty in which individuals can affirm themselves without knowing themselves. This is the grand solution promised by negative anthropology. In his 1976 Lenten conferences, Wojtyła observes that modern anthropology transplants the Promethean myth into the soil of Genesis. Told by Protagoras, the myth imagines a humanum that differentiates itself from the rest of animals only by the extrinsic addition of a technological art, which is stolen from the gods, which is then used to invent a world of culture, but more significantly, the civil measures of good and evil. Careful studies of human origins, Wojtyła proposed, is particularly important today if we are to understand the crucial problem of anthropology and ethics. In fact, in those Lenten conferences, he asserts, one cannot understand either Sartre or Marx without having first read and pondered very deeply the first 3 chapters of Genesis. The problem of human origins is not immediately a question of historical chronology, but rather a way to imagine and to experimentally explore experiences which undergird the proposition of negative anthropology, namely that man is an unknown being. Or, as Cardinal Wojtyła put it, man is alone and his greatness requires that this be so. Later, as Pope, he spoke to the Roman Rota of anthropologies that regard the human, given by nature, as merely raw data, a prolepsis or an outline of what man might be when he is made specifically human in the historical or cultural sphere. And Cardinal Cottier, a theologian of the papal household, points out that this view, we're no longer speaking of nature, but of a state of nature, an order of myth. And although it's been told in different ways, it's the myth of a proto-man who awaits humanization through the efficacy of culture, a sphere of freedom in which a multiplicity of forms can be imparted to this proto-humanum. Conclusion. The wars of the 20th century brought the state into question. That one fully determinate man, the state as sovereign, proved to be disastrous. The Protestant theologian Karl Barth aptly called the post-World War II time the era of disillusioned sovereignty. So the underlying premise or attitude of negative anthropology had to take a different turn when the state was no longer had such prestige. What it did is it took the predicates of sovereignty that had once been given to the state and transferred them back to individuals in the name of human rights. But what is the status of individuals who enjoy rights? How can a radically indeterminate human nature, allowing, even demanding freedom to make oneself to be whatever he pleases through choice, be a bearer of human rights? This is the crisis discerned by John Paul II. Imagine for a moment how strange that this might have seemed to Leo. Imagine this scenario. Imagine the repair of all of the institutions after the Second World War. We come generally to understand, it's not rocket science anymore, the need to limit state sovereignty according to constitutional democracy, to include bills and charters of basic rights that can be adjudicated by independent judiciaries. We've figured out now the importance of private property and a market economy regulated by a rule of law and directed to the well-being of society. We figured out polity is not in the church is not in polity. International assemblies with some authority are necessary to check unilateral declarations of war, to make modest but real interventions in cases of humanitarian crises. We figured out the importance of voluntary associations, both within domestic regimes and across jurisdictional lines. And suppose further, as the icing on the cake of how far we've come, that in the second half of the 20th century, the world was disabused of the utopianisms that prevailed in Leo's modern times. Marxism, fascism, racialism, and even more recently, the myth that markets are completely self-regulating. I mean, there are always perplexities at the level of policy, but at the external level, there is no profound doubt about what doesn't work at the level of institutions. Instead, the persistent doubt is directed to the nature and dignity of human persons who inhabit these institutions. Paradoxically, the only human right that stands firm in the court of public opinion is the right to revise one's own identity. This, I propose, is what JP2 discerned about our modern times. Man in flight from his own works and dominion. What do the human beings who inhabit institutions, which have been largely fixed, what do they want? They want a fixed order of rights protecting a fluid and revisable humanum. At his coronation in 1804, Napoleon and his consort Josephine were anointed on their heads and hands with holy chrism, reciting the prayer, God, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who was anointed by his Father with the oil of gladness. Napoleon then took the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and crowned himself Emperor of the French. That was the older modern times, which didn't hesitate to assert a robust humanism. It may be disordered, but it was not completely in flight from its own humanity. Today, the individual is self-crowned like the proverbial emperor who wears no clothes, no vestments of nature or supernature. Negative anthropology has rendered the three great institutions of human happiness, marriage, family, polity, and church, platforms for self-revision, but not for the perfection of a nature. Make no mistake about this. Negative anthropology, as at least a tag for this anthropological crisis, is not amenable to ordinary institutional solutions. It affects all of our institutions, but it's not the kind of crisis that can be fixed by a 5-year plan, right? You can't just call the police, like 911, I've got negative anthropology on my block or something, and it's in my schools too, and come and fix it. What in the domain of law or public policy can even touch it? We Americans, and if the truth be known, most Europeans too, have no patience for problems that cannot be solved by politics, law, with a bit of journalism. Okay. Leo had the easier crisis to deal with. Institutional fixes, sane institutional fixes. Only religion and philosophy, and I mean by philosophy the sapiential, deeper understanding of philosophy, are equipped to encounter negative anthropology. And it's very elusive. Only with great effort is it brought to the surface and put back in dialogue with Christian anthropology. And that dialogue is only just beginning. It took the Leonine Thomists more than a century to figure out how to give the Catholic answer to the institutional crisis. the anthropological crisis of our modern times is likely to be much longer protracted. Francis Collins, the leader of the Human Genome Project and director of the National Institutes of Health, has asserted, correctly it seems, the 21st century will be called the century of biology. There's no guarantee this will be a human biology. And there's almost every guarantee that the important questions surrounding that problem will prove more philosophical than scientific. So I want to end by saying we need to support the work of that academy going all the way back to Perugia in the mid-19th century, under the inspiration of the Doctor Humanitatis and Blessed John Paul II. We need to support institutions like the Center for Thomistic Studies. The reason why is only our philosophy has the patience to see this one through. It's not going to be fixed by law in 911. It's not going to be fixed by a public policy. It is going to have to be encountered at a much deeper level, and it's going to require enormous patience. So let's celebrate the fact that we're still doing this from Perugia until early 21st century. Let's keep it going and transmit it, along with the virtues of patience that it's going to take. Thank you very much.